The air inside Abernathy's John Deere dealership in the spring of '71 had a sacred smell. It was a mix of fresh green paint, vulcanized rubber, and the faint, sharp tang of hydraulic fluid. It was the smell of progress, of potential, the scent of a good year waiting to be broken open like fresh soil. For generations of farmers in Cedar County, this building was more than a store. It was a sanctuary, a place where a handshake meant more than a contract, and a man's word was his bond. But on this particular Tuesday, the sanctuary felt more like a courtroom. At the center of the polished concrete floor, under the long fluorescent lights that hummed with a steady electric prayer, stood Richard Sterling Jr. He was barely 25, but he stood with the kind of arrogant posture that only comes from inheriting land instead of earning it. His boots were new, his jeans were creased, and his plaid shirt was so clean it looked like it had never seen a speck of honest dirt. He was talking loud, waving his hands, a king addressing his court. His audience was one man, old Mr. Abernathy, the dealership's owner since the days of the two-cylinder Poppin' Johnnies. Abernathy was a wisp of a man, with skin like wrinkled parchment and eyes that had seen 70 years of droughts, floods, and bumper crops. He leaned against the counter, a rag in his hand, polishing a spot that was already clean. "It's simple, John," Richie was saying, refusing to call the old man Mr. "I need 6 new 4320s, cabs, duals, the whole 9 yards, and a new 7700 combine, the one with the turbo. I want them delivered by the end of the month. The bank's already approved the line of credit. We just need to sign the papers." Mr. Abernathy stopped polishing. He looked up at Richie, his gaze steady. "6, Richard. 6 4320s. Your father, he farmed twice the ground you do now, with 2 4020s and an old M farmall." Richie scoffed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed in the big room. "My father's dead, John, and so are his ways of farming. This is the new age. The university boys, the magazines, they all say the same thing. Get big or get out. You leverage your assets to increase your volume. It's economics." In the back of the dealership, by the parts counter, another man stood listening. Silas Blackwood was the physical opposite of Richie Sterling. His hands were thick with calluses and stained with grease that no soap could ever fully remove. His overalls were faded at the knees and patched on the thigh. He was 35, but the sun and the worry had etched lines around his eyes that made him look older. He was here for a simple hydraulic filter and a set of injector gaskets for his own 4020. A tractor his father had bought new in '68, the last major purchase he ever made before the cancer took him. That tractor was Silas's lifeblood, and he knew every bolt, every wire, every single groan and shudder it made. He watched the scene at the front unfold. He'd known Richie Sterling his whole life. Watched him grow from a spoiled kid into a man who thought money could solve any problem and debt was just a tool, like a wrench or a plow. "The bank might have approved it," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice quiet but firm, "but I'm the one who has to sign the dealer papers. Your father, God rest his soul, never carried a note he couldn't pay off in 2 seasons. What you're talking about, this is a 30-year mortgage, son, on machinery. It'll be worn out and rusted through long before you ever own it." "That's the point," Richie exclaimed, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "You trade it in before it wears out. You stay new, you stay efficient, you write off the depreciation. It's a tax strategy." Silas could see the pain in Mr. Abernathy's eyes. The old man wasn't just a dealer, he was a steward of the community. He'd helped men start with nothing, extending credit on a handshake when the banks wouldn't look twice at them. He'd seen farmers lose everything by getting in over their heads, and he recognized the smell of that particular disaster before it ever started raining. "I can't do it, Richard," Abernathy said finally. "I won't be the man who signs the paper that puts your family's farm at that kind of risk." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Richie's face went from confident to crimson in a heartbeat. The arrogance curdled into pure fury. "Risk?" He spat the word. "The only risk is listening to old dinosaurs like you who are too scared to get with the times. You're finished, Abernathy. I'll take my business to the case dealer in the next county. Or better yet, I'll find a way to get what I want right here." He turned on his heel and stormed out, the glass door shuddering in its frame behind him. Silas walked up to the main counter, Mr. Abernathy looked tired, as if the confrontation had drained the very marrow from his bones. "He's a fool, Silas," the old man whispered, not looking up. "He's got the bank behind him," Silas replied, his voice a low rumble. "And the bank doesn't care about a man's soul, just his signature." "Aye," Abernathy sighed. He turned and shuffled to the back to get Silas's parts. Silas paid in cash, the worn dollar bills counted out carefully onto the counter. He and Abernathy shared a look, a silent understanding between two men who believed in the old ways, in the religion of dirt and iron and honest sweat. It was a look that acknowledged a storm was brewing, far bigger than just one arrogant young farmer and a fleet of new tractors. Driving his dusty Ford pickup back to his farm, the parts riding on the seat beside him, Silas couldn't shake the image of Richie's face, twisted in rage. He thought about his own operation, 1,000 acres, free and clear. The land his great-grandfather had broken with a team of mules. His machinery was old, but it was his. The 40A20 Synchro range, the heart of his farm. His old 51 Farmall H for raking hay and running the auger. The Alice Chalmers Gleaner combine he'd bought at an auction and rebuilt himself. Each machine was a known quantity, a trusted friend. He could fix them with his own two hands, with tools he owned and knowledge passed down from his father. There was no bankman looking over his shoulder, no interest payment hanging over his head like a guillotine. He was a free man, and he was starting to feel like he was the last of his kind. Now, before we get any further into this, I have to ask you folks listening, have you ever seen a man so full of pride he couldn't see the cliff's edge right in front of him? Let me know down in the comments what you think of a young fella trying to buy 6 brand new tractors all at once on the bank's dime. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. The news came 3 weeks later, not as a rumor whispered over coffee at the town diner, but as a bold headline in the Cedar County Chronicle. Sterling family acquires local John Deere dealership. Silas read the article standing by his mailbox at the end of his long gravel lane. The words blurred together. Richie Sterling, fueled by his father's estate and an unprecedented loan from the Farmers Merchant Bank, hadn't just taken his business elsewhere. He'd bought the whole damn store. The article quoted the bank president, a slick man named Peterson, who praised Richie's forward-thinking business acumen and aggressive strategy for modernizing local agriculture. It mentioned that Mr. Abernathy was retiring to Florida, a move that sounded more like a forced exile. The next time Silas drove into town, the change was jarring. The old friendly Abernathy and Sons sign was gone, replaced by a massive gleaming green and yellow sign that read Sterling Ag Power. The lot, once a modest collection of new and used equipment, was now packed shoulder to shoulder with the biggest, most expensive machines John Deere made. 6 brand new 4320s stood in a perfect, arrogant line right out front, their paint so bright it hurt the eyes. The old ways were officially over. The sanctuary had been deconsecrated. That fall, during the frantic push of harvest, Silas's worst fears came to life. He was halfway through a field of corn, the old Gleaner combine chugging along, when the main drive belt for the cylinder snapped. It was a common failure, an easy fix, but he didn't have a spare. He had no choice. He had to go to Sterling Ag Power. The inside of the dealership was unrecognizable. The warm, cluttered parts counter was gone, replaced by a long, sterile Formica desk. The friendly, knowledgeable parts man, a fellow named Gus who could find a bearing for a 1938 Model B from memory, was also gone. In his place sat a young kid in a starched Deere shirt, staring blankly at a microfiche reader. Richie Sterling was there, of course, holding court near the front office. He saw Silas walk in, covered in dust and chaff, and a smug grin spread across his face. He didn't say a word, just watched, enjoying the moment. "Need a cylinder drive belt for an F2 Gleaner," Silas said to the kid. The kid blinked. "A what?" "Alice Chalmers, F2 Gleaner combine," Silas repeated, keeping his voice even. The kid fumbled with his price book. "We're a John Deere dealer, sir. We don't carry Alice parts." "Abernathy always did," Silas said, his jaw tightening. "He carried belts and bearings for every color tractor in this county. It was good business." "We're not Abernathy's," the kid said flatly, then looked past Silas to the next customer. Silas felt a hot flush of anger. He turned and walked out, Richie's silent, mocking grin burning into his back. He ended up losing a day and a half of perfect harvesting weather, driving 60 miles to a salvage yard to find a used belt that would get him through. As he drove, he saw Richie's brand new 7700 turbo combine working in a field, its massive corn head eating up 12 rows at a time, lights blazing into the twilight. It was a picture of relentless, expensive efficiency. And Silas, with his patched-up old machine, felt like a ghost haunting a world that no longer had a place for him. The real test came the following spring. It was the first week of May, the soil was finally dry enough to work, and every farmer in the county was in a race against the rain. Silas was in his North 80, pulling his disc with the 4020. The tractor was running sweet, the big six-cylinder diesel humming its familiar, powerful song. Then, without warning, there was a sound he'd never heard before. A sharp, metallic crack, like a giant hammer hitting an anvil, followed by a violent, lurching shudder that shook the whole 6-ton machine. The engine died instantly, and a plume of thick, bluish-white smoke poured from the exhaust stack. Silas knew immediately that it was bad. Not a clogged filter or a bad injector. This was internal. Catastrophic. He climbed down from the cab, his heart sinking into the soft earth. He unlatched the engine cowling. The side of the engine block, the solid cast-iron wall that contained the fury of 100 diesel horses, had a new, jagged hole in it the size of his fist. A piece of a connecting rod, mangled and scorched, was sticking out. The 4020 hadn't just broken down, it had grenaded itself. The walk back to the farmhouse was the longest of his life. Every step was a hammer blow of failure. His main tractor, his only big tractor, was dead in the middle of planting season. He spent the next 2 days in his workshop, a place that was usually his refuge, but now felt like a morgue. With a chain hoist and a set of heavy-duty rolling jacks, he split the tractor. It was a brutal, greasy, back-breaking job. He rolled the front half, the engine and the front axle, away from the transmission and rear end. The smell of burnt oil and hot metal filled the air. When he finally got the oil pan off and looked inside, the full extent of the disaster was laid bare. Number 4 connecting rod had snapped, sending the piston crashing into the cylinder head, shattering it. The crankshaft was scored beyond repair, and the block itself was ruined. He called Sterling Ag Power, knowing what the answer would be, but having to ask anyway. A new engine block was thousands of dollars. A remanufactured short block was almost as much. Money he didn't have. He couldn't even get a loan if he wanted one. Richie Sterling had made sure the bank saw him as a poor risk. The whispers started at the diner. Heard Silas Blackwood blew up his 4020. Tried to save a nickel on an oil change, I bet. That's what happens when you try to farm with antiques. He found his solution in the back of a farm auction paper. A salvage yard over in Nebraska had a wrecked 4020 that had rolled over, but the engine was said to be good. He borrowed his neighbor's stock trailer, drove 8 hours each way, and paid $700 cash for the dead tractor. He hauled it home and began the painstaking process of a heart transplant. For 2 solid weeks, as other farmers' corn began to sprout in neat green rows, Silas's fields lay black and empty. He worked from sunup until well past midnight, his workshop lit by a single bare bulb. He pulled the engine from the wreck, a greasy, heavy monster. He tore it down completely, checking every single part. He measured the cylinder bores with a telescoping gauge, checked the crankshaft journals with a micrometer, plasti-gauged every bearing. He replaced every gasket, every seal. His hands were cracked and bleeding, his back a knot of constant pain. He was not just a farmer, he was a surgeon, a mechanic, a machinist, fighting to save the life of his farm with nothing but his own grit and a set of old tools. One evening, a new pickup truck pulled into his yard. It was Richie Sterling. He didn't get out, just rolled down his power window. He looked at the dissected tractors, the grease-stained concrete, the dark, unplanted fields. "Looks like you're having some trouble, Blackwood," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "You know, I could have a new 4430 out here for you tomorrow morning. 0% financing for the first year. You could be done planting by the weekend." Silas wiped his hands on a rag, the gesture slow and deliberate. He walked over to the truck, his tired eyes meeting Richie's. "I like to own what I use, Sterling," he said, his voice quiet, and I like to sleep at night." Richie just laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Suit yourself. Enjoy the poorhouse." He rolled up the window and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled over Silas's broken machinery. The world seemed to prove Richie right. The early 70s were a boom time nobody had ever seen before. In 1972, President Nixon opened up trade with the Soviet Union, and the Russians, facing a massive crop failure, started buying American grain in staggering quantities. The price of corn doubled, then nearly tripled. Land that had been worth $500 an acre was suddenly worth $1,500, then $2,000. For farmers who were leveraged, who had borrowed big to plant fence row to fence row, it was like winning the lottery every single day. And no one won bigger than Richie Sterling. He was the golden boy of Cedar County. He bought another 1,000 acres, then 2,000 more, all on credit. The bank couldn't give him money fast enough. His fleet of green tractors was always the newest, the biggest. The 4320s were traded for the new Sound Guard body, 4630s with air conditioning and radios. He built a new house on a hill overlooking the valley, a sprawling brick palace with white columns that looked completely out of place in the Iowa countryside. He was featured in farm magazines, a poster child for the new era of aggressive, debt-fueled agriculture. Silas watched it all from his modest, paid-for farm. The grain boom was good for him, too. He got his resurrected 40-20 running, and it ran stronger than ever. He planted his crops late, but a timely rain and a long summer gave him a bin-busting yield. The money that flowed in was more than he'd ever seen. But while Richie was buying more land and more iron, Silas did something that made him a laughingstock in the community. He took his profits and he walked into the bank, the same one that was bankrolling Richie Sterling, and he paid off the last $10,000 on his farm's mortgage. The note his father had taken out 20 years earlier. The teller, a young woman who didn't understand, had to get the bank manager to find the old paper deed in the vault. When Silas walked out of that bank, holding the deed to his 1,000 acres, he was a completely free man. He owed nothing to anyone. Instead of celebrating, he felt a profound sense of isolation. The talk at the diner was merciless. Can you believe it? Silas Blackwood had the best year of his life, and he didn't even buy a new pickup, just paid off that old mortgage. He's scared of money. His daddy's ghost has him spooked. He'll never amount to anything. Silas ignored them. He didn't buy new machines. He used his cash to make his farm better, not just bigger. He hired a man with a tiling machine and laid thousands of feet of drain tile in his low-lying fields, an invisible investment that would pay dividends for decades. He bought a used but solid John Deere 730 diesel at an auction for a song. The old two-cylinder tractor, with its distinctive putt-putt exhaust note, was perfect for light jobs, saving expensive hours and fuel on his 40-20. To everyone else, it just looked like he was collecting more junk. One afternoon in the late summer of '74, Silas was at the co-op, waiting to unload a wagon of oats. Richie Sterling was there too, waiting for a semi-truck to be filled with fertilizer for his fall application. He swaggered over to Silas's old pickup. "Still driving this old thing, Blackwood?" Richie said with a sneer. "I heard you're debt-free. Congratulations. You're the richest poor man in the county. While you were burying clay pipe in your mud holes, I bought the old Miller section. Another 640 acres. You can't make money by being scared of it." "There's a difference between being scared and being careful, Richie," Silas said, not taking the bait. "No, there isn't," Richie shot back. "Not anymore. The game has changed. You either play, or you get left behind." A few months later, Silas had to go to the bank to get some papers notarized for a small land survey. While he was waiting, he saw the bank president, Peterson, on the phone in his glass-walled office. Peterson was usually the picture of calm confidence, but today his face was pale and he was running a hand through his slick hair. Silas couldn't hear most of the conversation, but a few words drifted through the thick glass, words that were alien to the farm economy he knew. Words like inflation, prime rate, and a name he'd never heard before. Volcker. Peterson hung up the phone and stared out the window, his confident mask gone, replaced by a look of genuine fear. He saw Silas looking at him, and he quickly forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. A cold knot formed in the pit of Silas's stomach. He looked out the bank's big window at the bustling town square. He saw the new cars, the farmers coming out of Sterling Ag Power with contracts for new equipment, the whole community drunk on the cheap money and high prices that they all thought would last forever. And Silas suddenly felt a deep, chilling certainty. The game was about to change again. The party was almost over, and a terrible reckoning was coming. The first sign of trouble wasn't a crack of thunder or a flash of lightning. It was silence, the silence of a July sky that refused to rain. Day after day through the summer of '78, the sun beat down with a merciless, white-hot intensity. The corn, which should have been a deep, waxy green, turned a pale, sickly yellow-grey, its leaves rolling inward as if in prayer for a drop of water that never came. The creeks dried up, leaving cracked mud mosaics where minnows once darted. The air grew thick with the fine dust of dying topsoil. For Silas, the drought was a hardship. For Richie Sterling, it was the beginning of the end. His massive new machines, the four-wheel drive 8630s and the fleet of 4640s he'd traded up to, sat idle for weeks, their tires slowly sinking into the parched earth. Their enormous engines, designed to pull 60-foot implements through heavy soil, were useless against the heat. To run them was to burn fuel for no reason, to watch $1,000 tires grind against baked clay. But the payments on them didn't stop. The interest clock ticked on, relentless as the sun. Silas, meanwhile, went back to the old ways. He hitched his ancient John Deere 730, the one he'd bought at auction, to a single-row cultivator. The old two-cylinder tractor sipped fuel, its distinctive putt-putt exhaust a gentle rhythmic counterpoint to the drone of the cicadas. He didn't try to cultivate all his acres. He focused on the low spots, the creek bottoms where a little moisture still lingered, carefully breaking up the crust around the struggling corn stalks to conserve what little water was there. It was slow, tedious work his neighbors had abandoned a decade ago in favor of chemical weed control. They laughed at the sight of him on the tiny tractor, a relic from another time. But Silas wasn't trying to get a bumper crop. He was just trying to survive. The drought broke in late August, not with a gentle soaking rain, but with a hailstorm of biblical fury. Stones the size of golf balls hammered the county, shredding what was left of the corn and shattering the windows on the north side of every farmhouse. The storm was followed by a deluge that turned the dusty fields into lakes of thick brown mud. When the ground was finally fit to run on, the race was on to salvage what little crop remained. That's when Richie's second problem began. The complex, sophisticated machines he had bet his future on started to fail. A hydraulic pump on one of his new 7720 combines went out. It wasn't a simple gear pump like the one in Silas's old Gleaner. It was a variable displacement piston pump, a marvel of engineering that cost $4,000 to replace, and the part had to be special ordered from the factory in Moline. While he waited, his other combine ingested a rock hidden in the mud, destroying the variable speed cylinder drive, a repair so complex it required a specialized factory technician to be flown in. Silas saw it firsthand. He had to go to Sterling Ag Power for a simple bearing for his grain auger. The dealership, once a bustling hub of activity, was eerily quiet. Two of Richie's brand-new combines sat in the service bay, their guts torn out, surrounded by a baffled-looking mechanic and a slickly dressed man with a briefcase from John Deere Corporate. Richie was there, pacing back and forth, his face pale and haggard. He was on the phone, yelling at someone about warranty claims and lost time. He looked like a king whose castle walls were crumbling around him. Silas got his bearing from Gus, the old parts man Richie had been forced to hire back because the young kid couldn't tell a cotter pin from a linchpin. Gus found the part in an old dusty bin, a place the microfiche reader didn't know existed. "He's in deep," Gus whispered, nodding towards Richie. "Floor plan interest is eating him alive. He's got $2 million of new iron sitting on the lot that nobody can afford to buy. And his own stuff is breaking down faster than he can fix it. He's learning that the more complicated the machine, the more expensive the silence when it stops working." Silas just nodded, paid for his $3 bearing in cash, and left. Driving home, he passed one of Richie's fields. A massive 8630 tractor sat stranded in the middle of it, a dark, silent monument to progress. It had been there for a week, waiting on a computer-controlled transmission part that was on back order from Germany. Silas looked at it, then looked at his own 4020, the one with the transplanted heart, chugging along reliably in the field next door. He wasn't getting rich, but he was moving. He was harvesting a meager crop, but it was a crop. And every part on his machine could be fixed with a wrench, a hammer, and his own 2 hands. The final blow came not from the sky or the soil, but from a man in a suit in Washington, D.C. In the winter of 1980, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter announced a grain embargo. The export market, the very foundation of the 70s boom, vanished overnight. The price of corn, which had hovered around $3 a bushel, collapsed to less than $2. The news hit Cedar County like a physical shock. The high prices had been the fuel for the fire of expansion, the justification for the massive debt. Now the fuel was gone, but the fire of debt raged hotter than ever. And then the man Silas had heard whispered in the bank, Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, made his move. To combat runaway inflation, he raised interest rates to levels no one had ever imagined possible. The prime rate, the number that governed every operating loan and mortgage in the county, climbed from a manageable 8% to 12%, then 15%, then a soul-crushing 20%. Every farmer with a variable rate loan, which was nearly everyone who had expanded in the last decade, was trapped. Their income had been cut in half, and their interest payments had more than doubled. It was a mathematical impossibility, a death sentence written in black ink on a bank statement. The first farm auction was a novelty. By the spring of '82, they were a weekly tragedy. Flyers appeared on the bulletin board at the co-op, stark black and white announcements of financial ruin. The names were familiar, families who had farmed the same ground for 100 years. Now their lives were being sold off to the highest bidder, one piece of machinery at a time. The biggest auction, the one everyone knew was coming, was Richie Sterling's. The flyer was printed on glossy paper, a full-color affair that seemed to mock the grim reality of the situation. Complete liquidation of Sterling Farms and Sterling Ag Power. The list of equipment went on for pages: 6 4640 tractors, 3 8630 four-wheel drives, 4 7720 combines with 12-row corn heads, a fleet of semi-trucks, and hundreds of other items. It was an empire's worth of iron, all of it less than 5 years old, all of it being sold to satisfy the bank. Silas went to the auction. He didn't go to bid or to gloat. He went because he felt he had to bear witness. The crowd was enormous, a sea of grim-faced farmers in seed corn hats. They picked over the equipment like vultures, kicking tires, checking engine hours, their faces betraying a mixture of pity and a desperate hope to snag a bargain from their neighbor's misfortune. Richie was there, standing by the porch of the big brick house he was about to lose. He was a ghost of the arrogant young man who had stormed out of Abernathy's dealership a decade earlier. His expensive clothes hung on his now thinner frame. His eyes were hollow, staring out at the rows of green machinery that represented his ambition and his ruin. He saw Silas in the crowd, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no mockery left in Richie's gaze, no pride. There was only a vast, empty landscape of defeat. The auctioneer started his rhythmic, hypnotic chant. The sound echoed across the valley, the final, frantic heartbeat of a dying dream. The machine sold for a fraction of what Richie had paid. A 4640 that had cost him $80,000 sold for $25,000. The combines went for less than half their value. The bank was taking a bloodbath, but they were taking it out of Richie's hide. Silas didn't stay for the whole thing. The spectacle of it made him sick to his stomach. This wasn't a victory for the old ways, it was a tragedy for the whole community. As he walked back to his old pickup, he saw Mr. Peterson, the bank president, talking to a group of men in suits. Peterson's face was ashen. The man who had so eagerly funded Richie's meteoric rise was now presiding over its brutal end, and it was clear the shockwaves were threatening to shatter his own institution. In the months that followed, a profound quiet settled over Cedar County. Fields that had once been planted fence row to fence row now lay fallow. The lights at Sterling Ag Power went dark, the massive sign a tombstone for a failed revolution. The bank foreclosed on half a dozen more farms before it, too, finally collapsed, its assets seized by federal regulators. The cheap money was gone, and it had taken the dreams of a generation with it. Through it all, Silas endured. His lack of debt was his armor. The low grain prices hurt him, but they didn't kill him. His property taxes were his biggest expense. He bartered his mechanical skills with his neighbors, trading a valve job on an old farmall for help putting up hay. He learned to weld and fabricate his own parts. His farm became an island of stability in a sea of chaos. The men who had once mocked him for being old-fashioned now came to him quietly, asking for advice. How do you set the timing on an old M? Know where I can find a water pump for a 40-20? He never turned anyone away. He shared his knowledge freely, understanding that the only way for the community to survive was together. He was a poor man by the standards of the 70s, but in the harsh reality of the 80s, he was one of the richest men in the county. He was free. One crisp autumn afternoon, 2 years after the auction, Silas drove his pickup into town. The old dealership building sat empty and forlorn, a for sale by FDIC sign flapping in the wind. A deep sadness washed over him as he looked at it. It wasn't just Richie's failure that the building represented, it was the death of Mr. Abernathy's legacy, a place that had been the heart of the farming community. On a sudden impulse, he drove out to the old Sterling homestead. The big brick house had been sold to a doctor from the city. But the original farmhouse, the one Richie had grown up in, was still there, looking small and tired. A plume of smoke rose from its chimney. Silas pulled into the lane. Richie came out onto the porch. He was wearing worn overalls and boots caked with mud. He was working for a farmer on the other side of the county. The last piece of land his family still owned, having been sold to pay off the final debts. They stood there for a long moment, the silence thick with the weight of the past 10 years. Heard you made it through, Richie said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its former arrogance. Heard you're doing okay. I'm surviving, Silas said, same as always. I was a fool, Silas, Richie said, looking down at his hands. I listened to the wrong people, the bankers, the university experts. They were all selling a dream that couldn't last. I thought you were a dinosaur, stuck in the past, but you weren't. You were just anchored. You knew the difference between what something costs and what it's worth. Silas nodded slowly. My father taught me that debt is a tool, not a lifestyle. He said the land doesn't care about the color of your tractor, but it remembers who pays the bills. They were quiet again. The wind rustled the dry leaves in the oak trees. The bank is selling the old dealership building, Silas said finally. The FDIC, they just want it off their books. They're selling it for pennies on the dollar. Richie looked up, a flicker of the old pain in his eyes. So? You going to buy it? Turn it into your own monument to being right? No, Silas said, shaking his head. I was thinking of buying it and reopening it. Not as a big new equipment dealer, as a repair shop, a place to get parts for the old stuff, to keep things running. A place like Abernathy's used to be. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. I'm a good mechanic, but I'm a terrible businessman. I'd need someone to run the front office, someone who knows the numbers, who knows the parts books for the new and the old. Someone who's learned a hard lesson about getting in over your head. Richie stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. He understood the offer. It wasn't charity, it wasn't pity. It was a second chance, a lifeline offered by the very man he had once despised. Tears welled in his eyes, the first he had allowed himself to shed through the entire ordeal. Why, Silas, he whispered, after everything? Why would you do that for me? Silas looked out over the rolling hills, the same land both their families had worked for generations. Because this county has had enough failure, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's time to start rebuilding. And a man deserves the chance to rebuild his own name. And so they did. They bought the old building, the two of them pooling what little they had. They took down the gaudy Sterling Ag Power sign and found the old hand-painted Abernathy and Sons sign in a dusty corner of the attic. They sanded it down and gave it a fresh coat of paint and hung it back up where it belonged. They brought Gus back to run the parts counter full-time. The business, which they simply called the Cedar County Ag Center, thrived. It became the nerve center for the survivors of the farm crisis. Farmers brought their broken-down equipment, and Silas, with Richie managing the books and ordering parts, brought it back to life. They didn't sell ambition, they sold resilience. Years passed. The 80s gave way to the 90s. The farm economy slowly healed, but it was a different world, scarred and humbled. The lessons had been learned in the hardest way possible. One warm spring evening, long after Richie had earned back his self-respect and become a partner in the business, Silas was out in his workshop. He was an old man now, his hair white, his hands permanently stained with the grease of a lifetime. His son, a young man with his father's quiet eyes, was with him. They were working on the old John Deere 730, giving it a tune-up before planting season. The boy tightened a bolt on the carburetor. "Dad," he asked, "why do we keep this old thing running? We could afford a newer tractor now." Silas wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the old tractor. Its green paint faded and chipped, its iron heart still strong. He thought of the boom and the bust, of Richie's arrogance and his redemption, of the silent fields and the auctioneer's chant. "We keep it running," Silas said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "to remember. We keep it to remember that the goal isn't to get big. It's to endure. This land doesn't belong to us. We just get to take care of it for a little while. This tractor, your grandpa's 4020 over there, they aren't status symbols, they're tools. And the most important thing a farmer can own isn't a new piece of iron. It's a paid-for deed and a clear conscience." He placed his calloused hand on his son's shoulder. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the black, fertile earth. The air was cool and smelled of rain on the way. It was the smell of a new season, of hope, of a legacy passed not through a ledger book or a bank loan, but through the quiet wisdom of the soil itself.